Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. All the praise is due to Allah. We praise Him and we seek His help and we ask for His forgiveness. And we take refuge with Allah from the evil of ourselves and from the evil consequence of our evil actions. We're here today to talk about the proof that Islam is the truth. Now, in the previous episode, we talked about and we discussed the written preservation of the Quran, how the Quran was preserved in writing over a period of the 23 years in which the Quran was revealed. However, it's very important to understand that primarily societies in the time of the Prophet Muhammad, may Allah's peace and blessings be upon him, were in fact oral societies. In other words, most of the information that they transmitted from one to the other was based upon stories, information that they remembered generation to generation, passed on from child to son, from father, daughter, and so on and so forth in gatherings. So this is how information was spread and memorized and stories were retained in the hearts and minds of people. And in that respect, the Quran is not really any different. However, the degree of the preservation of the Quran in its oral form is really something remarkable. And that is what we want to talk about today. Actually, the Quran itself mentions in the 17th surah, in the 106th ayah, the meaning of which is, and it is a Quran we have divided into parts, that you may recite it to men at intervals, and we have revealed it in stages. So the Quran is saying that it is a book that has been divided into parts, different chapters, and it was revealed at stages, and there is a great wisdom behind the creator of the heavens and the earth doing that. And the reason is because this facilitated the memorization and the retention of the Quran in the memories of people. God would reveal some verses of the Quran at a particular time concerning a particular incident, and people would memorize those verses. The Prophet ﷺ, the messenger of God, Muhammad, he would memorize those verses. Those companions who could write, those scribes, he would order them to write down the verses of the Quran, and they would write it down. But the Prophet himself, it's important to understand, was illiterate. He was ummi. He was a person who was not learned. He couldn't read and write. In fact, there were very, very few people in Arabia at that time who were actually capable of reading and writing. Very few of them. But some of them who could would write down the verses of the Quran on various bits of parchment and even palm leaves, or the cured animal skins or bits of papyrus, for example, which was all that was available at the time. But most people, they would memorize the verses of the Quran. Not only would they memorize them, but then they would try to inculcate and practice what those verses were teaching in their life. So this had a type of dual effect, memorizing it in terms of the actual words and then implementing it in terms of their actual actions. So this is one of the great wisdoms of the Quran being revealed in stages. It also meant that the implementation of Islam, the practice of the religion of Islam, was allowed to be done gradually. And this is really in concordance and in agreements with the human nature. It's very difficult for the human beings to suddenly change everything all in one go. And that is one of the amazing aspects of the revelation of the Quran, how it was revealed in stages, bit by bit, slowly, so that people were able to practice it in their lives. Now, one of the things the Quran tells us that is actually a recitation that has been made easy to memorize. The Quran actually, and in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that He has made the Quran easy to memorize. And this is something that is a really astounding fact, how the Quran has been memorized over the ages. And in order to aid that memorization amongst the generality of the Muslims, of course, the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the various imams or the people who were leading the prayers for the Muslims in different parts of Medina, for example, at the time, they would recite the Quran out loud in the dawn prayer and the sunset prayer and the night prayer. So they are constantly hearing the recitation of the Quran in the prayers. And this is especially more the case in the month of Ramadan. In the month of Ramadan, the Prophet Muhammad, may God's peace and blessings be upon him, would read through the whole of the Quran. And this was a habit that the Muslims had, and they retain it until today, of reciting the whole of the Quran in the month of Ramadan. And also, the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, may God's peace and blessings be upon him, he would also encourage the Muslims to memorize the Quran. In fact, it is a very, very virtuous thing in Islam to be a person who has memorized the whole of the Quran. Indeed, there was an incident where two companions who were very, very close friends died both at the same time. And the Prophet Muhammad gave the first burial and the most honored position in the grave to the person who had memorized the Quran the most. In fact, the person who is the Imam is most entitled to be the Imam because he has memorized the most of the Quran. Also, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he would encourage memorizing certain verses and certain chapters and certain or surahs of the Quran. For example, before the Friday prayer, the Prophet Muhammad used to encourage very much the reading of Surah Al-Kahf. Also, the Prophet Muhammad described, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he described, may God's peace and blessings be upon him, Surah Yasin as being the heart of the Quran. He said that Surah Al-Baqarah and Ali Imran would be intercessors for the people on the Day of Judgment, for the people who had memorized it. So all of these things were really an encouragement and a further incentive for people to memorize the verses of the Quran. So with all of these encouragements and the recitation of the Quran during the prayers, this is how, stage by stage, piece by piece, the Quran came to be memorized in the minds and the hearts of people. So let's look a little bit further into some of the aspects of this memorization. By the time the Prophet Muhammad, may Allah's peace and blessings be upon him, had died, we find that there are many, many different people who had become huffaz, or they had become memorizers of the entire Quran. And these people were very, very respected, of course, in the Muslim community because they had managed to memorize the entire Quran. And this memorization of the Quran was passed on generation after generation through all the generations of the Muslims until today. In fact, what we have is what is called a mutawatir transmission of the Quran. This concept of mutawatir, what does it mean? Well, essentially, it is an idea, or it means that so many different people have narrated a particular story or a particular thing from so many different directions. It is impossible, it's inconceivable that these people could have gathered together to invent a falsehood. In other words, imagine you have 1,000 people. These 1,000 people, each of them are teaching another 1,000 people. And each of those 1,000 people teach another 100 people. Can you imagine how many hundreds of thousands of people that constitutes? And is it possible that these people could have all gathered together and conspired together to invent something? No, it's not something that is possible. And therefore, it is considered in terms of the oral transmission, when something is mutawatir, there are so many people that have narrated it, then it's impossible that they could have invented something. And this is the case with the Quran. The entire Quran, every verse of the Quran has come to us throughout the ages, a continuous mutawatir transmission of these verses of the Quran. Also, when someone wants to become an expert, a hafiz of the Quran, that they will also have to sit with a teacher and they will have to learn the Quran in a special way. And we're going to discover a little bit more about this and this very important chain of teachers of the Quran all the way back to the Prophet Muhammad after the break. So don't go away. Join us after the break to discover more about the amazing Quran and its oral transmission throughout the ages. Assalamu alaikum.